massive levels of election fraud. And so if the Biden administration is so enthusiastic about peaceful protest, why are we not hearing any statements applauding or supporting the protesters in Brazil? Why is the media almost completely silent on what's happening in Brazil? So again, I have to assume here that we are being deceived. The idea that Joe Biden just really wants freedom in China strikes me as ludicrous. In fact, I don't think Joe Biden is really making much policy at all. He's reading a teleprompter as best he can. But I think we need to be very, very suspicious about what the Biden administration is doing, and also what the long-term documented track record of the media in the United States is that they are constantly putting out false information, manipulated information. And the New York Times told us that Fidel Castro was an anti-communist freedom fighter. The New York Times regurgitated Stalin's propaganda about the genocide he was conducting in the Ukraine, so they covered up that genocide as it was happening. So the media's got a long track record. They cannot be trusted. And I think this is another example of that.
So before we continue on with China, Alex, why do you believe the story is being ignored in Brazil? Why is it the blackout and the U.S. not making statements pertaining to it?
Well, I think what's happening in Brazil is actually one of the most important stories in the world. I say that as somebody who spent many years living in Brazil, as somebody who remains in touch with many, many Brazilians, including Brazilians who serve in government, Brazilians who serve in major businesses and other prominent positions. And a lot of people don't realize Brazil is actually almost the headquarters of the communist movement in Latin America. Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, the convicted criminal who supposedly won this election, he is actually a very important figure for the communist movement globally. Back about 30 years ago, he got together with Fidel Castro, the mass-murdering dictator of Cuba at the time. He got together with the FARC, in Spanish, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, basically a Marxist terrorist group that trafficked in cocaine to fund what has been for 50 years a brutal guerrilla war, massacred huge numbers of civilians, endless kidnapping, etc. Just an absolutely horrific terror organization. And also the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the communist movement there. And so they got together, they formed a network called, in Portuguese, the Foro de Sao Paulo, in English we call it the Sao Paulo Forum. And the objective of this network actually has a document. In 1997, they hosted their annual meeting, and as members they have political parties, basically the communist political parties, the socialist political parties of the region. About 2/3 of the governments of Latin America right now are in control of political parties that are members of this movement. And so in 1997, they got together and they put on paper that their objective was to restore in Latin America what had been effectively lost in Eastern Europe, namely communist dictatorship. So that's where Lula comes from. He's got very powerful allies in the United States, the Biden administration among them. In fact, we found out from some interestingly timed news reports that Biden had actually dispatched the head of the CIA, numerous senior defense officials and others to go tell Jair Bolsonaro, the anti-communist president of Brazil, that it would not be tolerated if he decided to contest the election result. So I think what's happening here is the communists are trying to seal the deal right now in Latin America. They've got strong support from George Soros. Barack Obama actually called Lula the most popular politician in the world. Quite a stretch. He's very unpopular among at least half of the Brazilian population, I think much more. But what's happening there is hugely significant. And if they manage to take back Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro was kind of an outsider, very counter-revolutionary, right? Incredibly hostile to communism, to the efforts to dismantle Christian civilization. He was always very, very tough on these things. I never expected him to become president, even though I had been watching his career for many years before he was elected. And I actually spent some time with his son earlier this year, who's a Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro, and he told me that they had solid intelligence that the communist movement was planning this massive electoral fraud, that they were going to try to jail critics, that they were going to arrest the media, freeze the bank account. So I think the reason we're not hearing about this media in America is because it's so important, and they've got to do this silently if they hope to succeed.
It's amazing, folks, and though you would think it'd be disjointed, Alex, very much connected to our topic today of communist China, a very definite tie there.
Absolutely, yep. And the BRICS alliance, and people don't realize the term BRICS was actually invented by the chief economist for Goldman Sachs. Right? This was not some kind of organic unity among third world governments. Right? This is much more sinister than that. But the BRICS were pretty much all in unison until Jair Bolsonaro came along, and he's been a thorn inside not just of the Latin American communists, but of the entire globalist movement. He's been very, very adamant that these COVID injections are dangerous, that we were being lied to about COVID. He refused to go along with the World Health Organization's policies. He's pushed back on the climate hoax. He has been a major thorn in the side of the internationalist movement, the communist movement, and he's done extraordinary things for Brazil to the point where now I think they already tried to kill him once. They claimed it was a lone nut, which is what they always do. But they are absolutely determined to see him removed because he's a major obstacle in the path of moving the entire world in the direction of this one world China system. So when you see the media in America promoting the protests in China, which are very small in comparison to what's happening in Brazil, and completely ignoring the protests in Brazil, you should at the very least be asking yourself some really serious questions.
Alex Newman with us here today. You'll find many of his writings, thenewamerican.com, thenewamerican.com. Alex, yet on this COVID issue, you saw a story just released from Newsmax indicating that hackers with links to the Chinese government stole at least $20 million in American COVID-19 relief benefits. That's according to a Secret Service unit that handles the pandemic relief fraud. But the hacking group is identified as APT41, looks like Apartment 41, based in Chengdu, also known by the name of Wicked Panda. I'm sure this is just a tip of the iceberg as far as it relates to COVID fraud.
Oh, absolutely. And what's so interesting about that, too, the world expert on this is Joshua Phillip, a friend of mine at the Epoch Times, who really studies communist Chinese criminal movement. And what he has shown is that so many of these supposed criminal gangs are really just extensions of the Communist Party's machinery. So it looks like they're just rogue criminals, and we've got them floating around in the United States, triage, etc. But they are deeply connected to the communist government in China, and if the communist government didn't want them doing these types of scams, they wouldn't be doing it.
I'd like to cover yet another aspect of China's increasing threat, Alex, and that is a report that just came out from the Pentagon last week regarding China's nuclear arsenal, expected to more than triple to 1,500 warheads by 2035. That's no small news item.
No, it's not. And I think people need to understand clearly what's happening here. What we are seeing is preparations for war by the most murderous dictatorship in the entire history of humanity. And those preparations for war are not aimed at taking over a small island with 30 million people. Right? That may be the immediate objective, but is the target. And there's a really interesting doctrine about this.
I'm going to just have you pause there because we're right up against the break. That's a remarkable statement, though. I mean, we're not talking about solely Taiwan, but there's, what do they say, bigger fish to fry? Folks, we'll be back in just 1 minute. Alex Newman is with us today about Communist China's growing threat. The U.S. is not viewed as being a friendly neighbor to let's just all get along. No, world domination is on the heart of China. We'll be back with more in just a minute.
Often, the sounds of traditional Christmas carols are missing this time of year. The secularization in our society does not want to recognize those carols which point to the Christ of Christmas. VCY America is making available Sounds of Christmas, Volumes 3, 5, and 6. The various selection of Sounds of Christmas features the music of the season as played by Vic Eliason on the digital piano, Hammond organ, and Allen organ. Songs like Go Tell It on the Mountain, Oh Little Town of Bethlehem, and Joy to the World. These instrumental CDs are perfect for playing in your home, office, or car throughout the season. Each volume of Sounds of Christmas is available for a donation of $6 each, or all three for a donation of $15 to VCY America. Call 1-800-729-9829 and have a Merry Christmas.
The program you're listening to is Crosstalk. It comes your way each weekday at the same time on the VCY American Network. With us today is Alex Newman. You'll find he's an award-winning international freelance journalist. So many of his writings and others like him at thenewamerican.com, thenewamerican.com. And friends, just exposing what's taking place in this world today and not just accepting carte blanche, what you're told by the nightly news. Alex, you mentioned just heading into that last break here that it's not just an island that is in China's crosshairs. Really, it's the United States, and that they are really in an all-out preparation for war. So go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, Jim. And, I think this is one of the most critical things for people to understand right now who are interested in geopolitics. And it's finally starting to dawn on more and more conservative people in Washington, D.C. at least, that this is what we're facing. But Communist China is not just preparing for war against the United States. They are already waging war against the United States. And some of this strategy has been put on paper. Colonel, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name, but Xiao Liang and Colonel Wang Chung-Sui have actually written a document. I'm holding it in my hand right now on unrestricted warfare. And it's about China's strategy. If you look into their strategic thinking, a lot of it even goes back to the great military strategist Sun Tzu, right? You have to be very deceptive when you're waging war. When you're weak, you have to pretend to be strong. When you're strong, you have to pretend to be weak. And so this doctrine of unrestricted warfare, the Communist Chinese recognize that if they were to enter into a conventional war with the United States right now, involving actual shooting, actual missiles flying, nuclear weapons, etc., there's a good chance that they would come out on the losing end. At this point, I can't even say that with a whole lot of confidence anymore based on my discussions with people who study these types of things. But there's a very good possibility that they would not win, at least not right this moment. And so what they've been doing is this concept of unrestricted warfare, where they will wage war in every possible way, up to, but not including, shooting and missiles and actual combat. So I think that's the stage that we're in right now. They are engaged in subversion. They are engaged in massive levels of espionage. They are stealing all of our secrets, military, corporate, governmental, diplomatic. All of it is being vacuumed up by Communist China's intelligence apparatus. They are helping to fuel unrest in the streets of America. They are working against us in every international institution that you can think of. They are building a global coalition of allies to stand against the United States. But honestly, the thing that most concerns me about all of this, Jim, is the fifth column that we have in the United States that has shown a very, very brazen willingness to side with the Chinese against their own country. And this includes, unfortunately, people at the highest levels of power. We know that Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, went into business with one of the top intelligence officials in Communist China. Now, it's not because the Chinese think that Hunter Biden is some sort of wonderful businessman. I mean, poor guy's addicted to crack, or he was. It's obviously not, it's not for his business savvy that they are interested in him. And we know that the big guy, Joe Biden himself, was getting 10% from these deals. So at the highest levels of power, if you look at the communications companies operating out of D.C., the law firms operating out of D.C., they are all terrified or on the payroll of the Chinese. So we're dealing with potential adversary. I would say not potential, but an actual adversary that is incredibly powerful and that has very strong support from some of the most powerful people in this country.
This is what's just so maddening is that, I saw one report where Washington has publicly named Beijing as the most significant challenge in the United States, and yet, Alex, it seems we're more concerned about critical race theory training and gender-inclusive training for our troops, four-shot mandates, than we are preparing for the increasing of our strength and standing up against Communist China. And let me throw in North Korea into this here, too, because they certainly are not headed toward passivity at all, and it's like we are imploding from within.
Yeah, we are, and I think this is all by design. This is very deliberate. And if you go back and look at the history, and we've talked about this briefly on a previous episode, Jim, but if you go back into the history, what you'll find is that the very same organizations and institutions that like to think of themselves as running the United States today, Council on Foreign Relations, for example, Bilderberg, all these networks of very prominent individuals that kind of surround the Rockefeller dynasty and other very prominent American families, they have been not just in support of, but helping the communists in China from the very beginning. In fact, they deliberately betrayed our ally, Chiang Kai-shek, who fought alongside Americans in World War II against the Japanese. He was a pro-Vest Christian. He believed in individual freedom. In fact, he saw America as a model for his country, and yet policymakers in our country, people like George Marshall, who served as the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, also was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, deliberately betrayed him. They put an embargo on his government to force him to capitulate to the communist Chinese, who were being backed by the Soviet Union and so on. And so very powerful Americans helped the communists take over in China. In fact, in the American media, they were described as just agrarian reformers, right? That is how they were marketed to Americans, through terrible propaganda placed in the American media. So they helped them take power, they helped build them up. And a lot of this they did openly, Jim. Right? David Rockefeller, in 1973, he had just come back from China, and he published an op-ed in the New York Times that is still available in their archives today. It was called From a China Traveler. And after returning from China, he had just incredibly wonderful things had to say about China. He said the social experiment, and this is almost a direct quote, the social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. Now, about 50 million people had been slaughtered by the government there up to that point. How a person could say that is just beyond me. Then in 2010, you had George Soros say that Communist China should own the New World Order. He said it publicly. He says they have a better functioning government than the United States. So these people have been helping to build up Communist China at every step of the way, and I think that's how we ended up in this predicament.
There's one more tentacle of this I'd like to get covered here today as well, Alex, and that is the area of big tech. And I saw one headline, China abusing Apple. We saw also, Tucker Carlson reported here recently, Apple now an active collaborator with China's murderous police state as they prevent dissemination of news pertaining to the protests going on. How do you see big tech assisting China, or China taking control of big tech that would increase their threat against people like the United States of America and the freedoms that we love?
Well, I think there's several things going on here. I think one of the most obvious things that should jump out at everybody is that the people running these big tech companies think very much like the Communist Chinese do. That we do not have a right to express ourselves freely. We do not have a right to freely access whatever information we want to access and make our own determinations about whether that information is true or important, etc. They want to make those decisions for us. So this is an incredibly elitist, incredibly anti-American way of looking at things. But just last week, I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Zach Voorhees, who was a senior engineer at Google and at YouTube. And one of the things he told me is that Google and YouTube and all of big tech are absolutely filled with spies from Communist China serving this mass murdering Communist Chinese party. So I think we need to take all that into account as we're thinking about this. I do think that big tech, in partnership with China and in partnership with the institutions that I mentioned earlier, like the Council on Foreign Relations and increasingly even the Biden administration, they are working to change the narrative, suppress free speech, suppress information that runs contrary to their narrative. And I think it's an existential threat to our country. As Mr. Voorhees told me in public, this was an on-the-record interview, people can go watch the whole thing, he said we need an urgent national security investigation of this crisis immediately. It is an existential threat to our nation. And I agree with him. He's exactly right.
Alex Newman, our guest today. Our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. That's 1-800-733-9829. Your questions or brief comments today. Alex, another big thing that many people are scratching their heads on is election interference. Is there connections between our China and election interference?
I think self-evidently there is. And in fact, one of the things that just came out of Twitter right now is that Twitter was openly interfering in the election. I mean, some of the emails that came out in this Twitter files that Matt Taibbi has been releasing show senior Twitter executives working in partnership with the Biden campaign to squelch information that they didn't want. And so when you combine that with the knowledge that there are Communist Chinese spies all up and down the ranks of these big tech companies, when you combine that with the knowledge that the leadership of Communist China is working very closely with the leadership of the Western world, people like Klaus Schwab, his young global leaders, people like Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, prime ministers and presidents all over the world. In fact, even Elon Musk was purportedly one of his young global leaders. You start to realize that what we're dealing with here is a very, very serious crisis, and it really should make everybody wonder about the credibility of our elections, the integrity of our elections. I think what we're seeing in Arizona right now is just the tip of the iceberg, and when you combine that with what we know about what Communist China is doing with unrestricted warfare, etc., this really should be seen as an incredibly significant national security crisis and existential threat to our country. And it really should be a top priority for policymakers in Washington, D.C., but unfortunately it seems to not even be on their radar for the most part.
CJ is calling from Florida. Hi, CJ, you're on the air.
Hi. My question is, can our government be accused of treason for what's going on, our president? Thank you.
Does it rise to the level of treason?
It's a very good question. And treason traditionally has been defined as helping an enemy wage war on your own country. And I think there's a very good case that could be made, not just for the Biden administration, but even going back to the Obama administration, that is the appropriate word to describe what we're dealing with here. During the Obama administration, you even had top-level government officials coming out and telling us publicly that the Obama administration had decided to partner with Islamic jihadists like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS. We had the head of military intelligence at the time, General Michael Flynn, in an international TV broadcast, and he said, look, I told the Obama administration that it was a bad idea and probably illegal to partner with Islamic jihadists who are on our terror list that we've been fighting against for over a decade as part of this war on terror. And yet they were doing it anyway, and they were doing it deliberately. Now we have the situation where the Biden administration really couldn't help Communist China more if they tried. And they could try to claim ignorance, but we didn't realize that the Communist Chinese were preparing for war against us, or were actually waging unrestricted warfare against us. But considering the budget of the intelligence agencies, I don't think that's a credible argument. So I think it's a discussion that we really ought to be having as a nation.
Mark is next in Monroe, Wisconsin. You're on the air.
Okay, my question is this. Recently, American media has been suggesting that there would be a Chinese communist collapse, particularly in regard to the recent COVID-19 protests. My question is, do you think this is a deliberate attempt from China to make the U.S. in particular vulnerable to misinformation tactic that would make us vulnerable in regard to this? In other words, they have a much bigger agenda and are just prompting us to be vulnerable.
Thank you, Mark. Go ahead, Alex. We got about 20 seconds here.
Yeah, I think that's a very important possibility that ought to be considered. Again, we're dealing with massive levels of disinformation at multiple levels coming at us from multiple angles. And so I don't think we should be trusting what the media says. And before we go to break, I wanted to just mention, too, Chinagate, the Bill Clinton scandal, where they were caught taking Communist Chinese money in exchange for our military secrets. That was treason.
Thank you for the call, Mark. We'll be back with more of your calls right after the break. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewreport.com. Have you noticed all of the events that are converging at the same time right now? What is the statistical probability that all of these things will be happening right now at the same time? I believe it's a convergence of in-time events. The making of a one-world economy, the mark of the beast technology, the desire for a world government, a world religion, the Jews returning to Israel in record numbers, the talk of a third temple, 5 red heifers now in Israel looking for a perfect red heifer to sacrifice and begin the purification process. Israel discovering massive amounts of natural gas and maybe gold. Israel surrounded by her enemies. Right there in Syria, you have Iran, Turkey, and Russia on her border. Then you have the Jews that are being prepared to be deceived, looking for a Messiah. We have the rise of anti-Semitism, the talk of global famine and plagues. All of this tells us the stage is being set for end-time events. Are you ready?
Return to Crosstalk on VCY America. Alex Newman with us today. We're discussing Communist China's growing threat. Alex is a senior editor for The New American. Alex, just before we take our next call, just give us a word about The New American, if you would.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jim. So the New American is, in my opinion, the single best magazine on the planet. It comes out twice a month. I highly encourage people to subscribe to the French version if they haven't yet. And I think there's an article that was published in 1991 that is very, very relevant. It's called Playing the China Card that I encourage people to read. But you know, I'm fairly young. In fact, the magazine was created as a result of a merger between 2 other magazines the same year I was born. That was in 1985. And I go back and I read the things that were being written by the New American in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I'm just astounded. If I didn't know better, I'd wonder whether these guys had some sort of crystal ball, because they somehow knew what was going to happen, where all this was headed, even before anybody else was talking about it. So it's a great publication. It's the official publication of the John Birch Society, which actually started the campaign during the Clinton administration to have him impeached for Chinagate, and actually succeeded. Bill Clinton was the first elected president to ever be impeached, and multiple major media outlets credited the John Birch Society with that, but they ended up sweeping that scandal under the rug and getting everybody talking about perjury and sex act, which of course are serious, but not quite as serious as treason, perhaps. But anyway, it's a very good magazine. It's been an honor to write with them since my college days. It was such a joy to find out that there was a publication where truth could be published freely, and people can find us at thenewamerican.com.
Jeff is next in Wisconsin. Jeff, you're on the air.
Yeah, great topic. Look, I wish I could get people to understand that we've been fighting the same enemies since Andrew Jackson. Okay, we've got the European banking houses and the ultra wealthy in this country have always teamed up. Okay, we bankrolled the Bolsheviks and the overthrow of the Tsar. Okay, our rich elites, they bankrolled both sides of the First World War and the Second World War. Our government was infiltrated with communists during FDR. It just goes on and on. And is there any way to really fight against it? Their dialectic is we seem to be. We're not immune to it. We just don't seem to be able to fight their dialectic.
Alex?
Yeah, great question. And I think in the physical, it's very difficult to battle against this. We're dealing with, ultimately it goes way beyond just European banking houses and corrupt so-called elites, at least self-proclaimed elites. That what we're dealing with here, I think, very clearly is satanic and diabolical. And I think when you consider it from a spiritual perspective, and the Bible talks quite a bit about the spiritual war that we find ourselves in today. Ephesians 6, chapter 6 is probably the clearest chapter dealing just with this idea of a spiritual war that we find ourselves in. And what it says is that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but rather against powers, principalities, and spiritual wickedness, darkness in high places. And the Bible also says that our weapons are not carnal, but they are mighty for pulling down strongholds. And so, I think there is an important role for politics. There is an important role for national security and all these things. But ultimately, this is a spiritual crisis in the truest sense of the term. If Americans were still in love with God, if Americans were still relying on the Bible as their source of truth and authority, the country wouldn't be in the mess that it finds itself in. So, one of the things that I tell people in terms of what do we do about this? Well, do what God told me to do. Right? Go out and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all the things that I have commanded you. And that's important. And as the population comes and clings to the Lord, very good things happen. Good things happen to the whole nation. And so I think we really need to keep that in mind. Yes, we should be involved in the political realm. We should be involved in exposing these lies. We should be using the truth as our weapon. But this is a spiritual battle.
Thank you, Jeff. Great question. Todd is next. Sheboygan, Wisconsin. You're on the air.
Yeah, Alex, I was just wondering if you've read the book by Gordon Chang, The Coming Collapse of China, and if so, what do you think about that? I'm sure you know him, and if you've read it, according to him, very soon China's going to be collapsed. What do you know about that?
Yeah, thank you for the call. I have enormous respect for Gordon Chang. I think he's an extremely astute analyst, and he's got wonderful sources and connections. I don't happen to agree with him on this, though. Yes, there are massive economic problems in China. Yes, China is a cooking bomb. What they're sitting on top of is just massive levels of pent-up anger and rage, especially after 2.5 years of unprecedented barbarism in response to COVID. But they are very cunning. They're very intelligent in terms of how they manage that. And so I think without rehashing it all, I would encourage you to read the 1991 article Playing the China Card. It may look like a collapse of the Communist Party of China, but I think what will be very likely after that is it will be the same people in charge, maybe behind the scenes, maybe not. Very much along the lines of what we saw after the Soviet Union collapsed. Yeah, they collapsed. Supposedly, yeah, their economy was in shambles. But guess what? The new rulers were the same as the old rulers. They just rebranded themselves. Instead of Communist Party Commissar, they were oligarchs in charge of oil or whatever. So I think we need to examine communist strategy to get some insight on this. And communist strategy would lead me to believe that we may see a controlled collapse, but it will not result in very profound changes, at least not in terms of who's running things.
Thank you, Todd. Jim is next. You're on the air, Jim.
First of all, Alex, thank you for bringing balance to all these topics about ultimately our battle is spiritual. Thank you so much for that. But I think about our wide open southern border and the millions of people flooding in here, thousands of fighting age young men coming across that border. I believe that there's an invasion of a standing army in this country now. And I just wonder if this the tactic of the Chinese to use these groups that have come in, whether they be Islamists or other groups, as cannon fodder.
Jim, just for the sake of time, because we're down to just less than 30 seconds, Alex, go ahead and respond to our southern border issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what is happening is exactly what you said. Professed enemies of the United States are pouring across the southern border. We know that the regime in Venezuela has been sending militants, militias, emptying out jails. Many other governments have as well. There are Chinese cells all over this country, active and ready to go at a moment's notice. So yeah, America's in a battle for her survival. The open southern border is a big part of it, but we need to pray and be in God's word because we may be hitting some real serious turbulence there.
And Lord willing, tomorrow we have representatives from the Center for Immigration Studies talking about the southern border. Alex, as always, thank you for your insights and analysis and for exposing these many evil works of darkness.
Thank you so much, Jim. God bless.
And friends, thanks for joining us here today on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Take Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk. With SRN News, I'm Joe.